A three-star American general gave away his own seat on the last plane out of Burma and then had his radio smashed so that nobody could order him onto another one. Joseph Stilwell, 59 years old, commander of 3 Chinese armies that had stopped obeying him, with Japanese columns closing on every road, every airfield, and every river crossing behind him. The transport at Shwebo came for the general and his inner circle. Stilwell filled it with staff officers and clerks, stood on the strip and watched it lift away toward India, and then walked back into the collapse. What he did next, no other commander in Burma tried. He put himself at the head of 114 people, most of whom had no business in a jungle at all. 19 Burmese nurses, a missionary, a reporter, Chinese soldiers, British stragglers, cooks, drivers, 140 miles of mountain and river between them and India, and the monsoon already coming down. He told them what the day would cost, 14 miles minimum every single day. He told them a lot of them would hate him before it was over. Then he told them the part that made no sense at all. Every one of them was getting out alive. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. On the last day of April, in a battered railway town called Shwebo, 60 miles north of Mandalay, Joseph Stilwell opened his diary and wrote down the thing nobody in Washington wanted to read: imminent danger of disintegration and collapse. Underneath it, he did the arithmetic: 40 people going to Myitkyina, 12 to Kata, 20 staying here. That was the American command in Burma at the end of April 1942. Not divisions, not corps people, counted off in dozens, and a general deciding which dozen went where. Now, the Japanese already knew exactly where he was. Bombers came over Shwebo and worked the town, while Stilwell's staff sat in it, and his officers were convinced the location had been handed to the enemy by a local priest. Stilwell wasn't the kind of commander who moved his headquarters because of that. He kept working through the raid, and what worried him wasn't the aircraft, it was the map. Here's what the map said. 3 Chinese armies, the 5th, the 6th, and the 66th, were in Burma under his command, on paper, by the personal order of Chiang Kai-shek. The 6th had been broken open at Tungu. The rest were sliding north in a mob, mixed in with British stragglers, Indian drivers, and a river of civilians walking for India. Stilwell had spent weeks trying to get Chinese divisions to move where he wanted them, and the divisions kept checking with Chungking first, and Chungking kept changing its mind. On the 29th of April, Chiang sent word that Mandalay was to be held at all costs. Mandalay could not be defended by anybody with anything, and every professional soldier in Burma knew it. The next day, Chiang reversed himself. So think about what Stilwell actually held in his hands that week. He had a title, he had a theater, he had armies on an organization chart. What he didn't have was the power to make one Chinese regiment turn around and face south. This is the part of high command that never makes it into the memorial statues. Authority is a piece of paper until somebody obeys it, and by the last week of April in Burma, nobody was obeying anything. Stilwell had been given the responsibility for a catastrophe and none of the machinery to stop it, and he knew the difference better than the men who had handed it to him. He tried anyway. That's the part you have to sit with. He planned to fly east to Loiwing, near Lashio, to see whether anything could still be pulled together on that flank. Loiwing was gone before he could get there. Abandoned, the airstrip that Claire Chennault's pilots had used already given up. Alexander, commanding the British, had ordered the evacuation of Burma. The order didn't start anything. It just put a name on what was already happening on every road. So the doors were closing one at a time, and Stilwell could count them. Door 1 was the air. He'd asked for a transport at Shwebo, and around noon on the 1st of May, Colonel Caleb Haynes brought a C-47 down onto the strip. This was the way out. A flight to Calcutta, a hot meal, a cable to Washington, a general delivered safely to India where a general is supposed to be. The engines stayed up. Haynes waited. Stilwell went down the list and started calling names. staff officers, headquarters clerks, 15 men who would have walked into a Japanese column within a week if they'd stayed. He packed them into the fuselage, stepped back, and Haines lifted off north of Mandalay and turned west. Stilwell stood there and watched his seat go over the horizon. Now, more aircraft were supposed to come in behind that one. Stilwell didn't wait for them. He got his remaining people into trucks and jeeps and pushed north along the tracks of the Mandalay to Myitkyina Railway, into the mess, deeper into the country everybody else was trying to leave, because Door 2 was still open, and Door 2 was Myitkyina. Myitkyina had an airfield in the far north of Burma, still operating, still flying out the sick and the wounded. Frank Dorn, his aide, laid out what the general was thinking. Get the party to Myitkyina. Fly out every American except a small staff and a few doctors. Keep those doctors with the Chinese. Then set up a base in the Hukong Valley and start planning the counteroffensive that would take Burma back. Read that again. His army was disintegrating around him. His headquarters had been bombed. His commander-in-chief was sending orders that contradicted themselves inside 24 hours. And Joseph Stilwell was still thinking about the attack. He reached Saigon on the evening of the 1st of May at the headquarters of the Chinese 5th Army, Pinta on the 2nd, Wunto on the 3rd. Americans kept joining him along the road, coming out of wherever they'd been posted, and the party swelled from 80 toward 100 and more. Getting to Myitkyina meant the railroad. Stilwell sent his transportation officer, Captain Paul Jones, up the line to check it. Jones came back with the news that shut Door 2. There'd been a collision on the tracks. Trains were jammed solid, north and south, and nothing was moving through. There were no roads to Myitkyina that would carry a vehicle. The airfield was still up there, still taking off, and Stilwell had no way on earth to reach it. At Wunto, on the 3rd of May, he wrote the coldest line in the whole diary. It is now apparent that we can no longer be of much use. Decided to send our crowd out. You have to understand what that sentence cost the man who wrote it. Stilwell had spent 40 years in the infantry to arrive at a theater command, and he'd held it for about 10 weeks. Now he was writing down, in his own hand, that he had become useless. Door 3 was west. West meant abandoning the vehicles somewhere, crossing the Chindwin, and climbing into the Naga Hills on foot in the last few days before the monsoon closed the trails. Nobody in his party had done anything like it. Gordon Seagrave, the missionary surgeon who'd brought his hospital unit and his 19 Burmese nurses in with the column, was 45 years old. And at the end of April, he'd written that all this talk of tramping out of Burma had him worried. The malaria kept coming back on him. He had 4 open sores on his feet and nothing in his bag that touched them. His nurses were girls in their teens and 20s. Stilwell's own aide, Frank Merrill, had a heart that was about to quit on him, and there was still one thing Stilwell had to do before he could take that door. He had to make sure that nobody could come back and fly him out. The 4th of May, in the diary, reads like a man writing with the roof coming down on him. Disintegration at Shwebo, Japanese moving up the Chindwin River, civil war conditions all over again, Chinese out of control. That was the situation report of the senior American officer in the theater, and it fit in 4 lines. Now, the road out of Indore was the only decent road in that part of Burma, and by the 5th of May, it belonged to the mob. Chinese soldiers who'd stopped being soldiers, British stragglers, Indian drivers, families walking north with what they could carry. Stilwell's column was trying to get onto that road ahead of the flood, and the flood didn't care that a lieutenant general was in it. He watched his own convoy get shouldered off the road by fleeing troops he was supposed to command, and he went back to his diary that night sounding like a coach who'd just been run over. If he could only get them around the corner. Battled all afternoon to push them forward, ahead of the Chinese rush. Everybody fooled around, and sure enough, the Chinese came up and poured through. They went right through us, he wrote, like Red Grange, the galloping ghost, a football player from Illinois that no Chinese private in Burma had ever heard of. That's what was left of Joseph Stilwell's tactical control on the 5th of May, 1942. A joke about a running back, written by lamplight, by a man whose armies had just trampled straight over him on their way north. The trucks went first. They kept bogging down in the rutted mud, holding the column to a crawl. And late on the 5th, Stilwell ordered them abandoned. The jeeps he kept. The jeeps carried what mattered, and one of the things they carried was the radio. Here's the thing about that radio. It weighed 200 pounds. It moved on wheels, or it didn't move at all. And it was the last piece of physical machinery connecting the American command in Burma to the outside world, which meant it was also the last thing that could get Joseph Stilwell rescued. He had one more message to send with it. On the 6th of May, from a clearing west of Indore, the set went up and Stilwell dictated to New Delhi, heading for Homelin and Imphal with a party of 100, hoping to make Homelin by the 10th. Send 500 pounds of food from Imphal by carriers to meet us. Warn the Indian government that rice, police and doctors are urgently needed on every route into India, that large numbers are on the way, that all control is gone, and that catastrophe is quite possible. Then one word to close it: end. He told India that a catastrophe was coming for the refugees. He hadn't asked India for anything for himself. And then Stilwell ordered the radio destroyed, 200 pounds of it, wrecked where it stood. The code books and the files burned, so nothing usable could fall into Japanese hands. Look at what that act actually did to him. Burning the codes was standard practice. Smashing the set was standard practice. The consequence, though, was that Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell had just made himself unreachable. No orders in, no rescue flight vectored to a clearing, no cable from George Marshall telling him that his personal safety mattered more than 114 strangers in a jungle. From the moment that set stopped working, nobody in Washington, Chongqing, or New Delhi could tell him to save himself, and nobody could come and get him. Whatever he was going to do about these people, he was now going to do without a way out and without a superior. You can hear what he thought about the odds in what he said to Frank Dawn about Homelin, where the Japanese might get there first. If they meet them, Stilwell said, the enemy will have a fight on their hands. He wasn't going to let them grab these people without a scrap. So who exactly was he talking about? 26 Americans, mostly officers, 15 British soldiers, 14 Chinese soldiers who'd become his bodyguard, Gordon Seagrave's hospital unit, including the 19 Burmese nurses, a small Quaker ambulance crew, men who wouldn't carry weapons at all, Jack Belden, a correspondent for Time and Life who'd walked out of one collapsing front already, the Reverend Breedham Case, a missionary who'd spent years in Upper Burma and spoke the Hill languages, which was the reason Stilwell handed him the job of hiring porters, cooks, drivers, clerks, teenage girls in nurses' uniforms. That was the command. They had a few things going for them, and Stilwell knew what each one was worth. The soldiers were still armed and still knew how to use what they carried. The medical people were the best asset in the column, because in that country, the enemy that would take them apart wasn't Japanese. And the party had money, real money, which meant food and porters and boats could be bought from any village willing to sell. What they didn't have was time. The monsoon was days away, maybe less. Once the rains came in hard, the trails would turn to mud, the streams would come up, and the mountain track into India would stop being a track at all. Stilwell did the arithmetic on a map, out loud, and got a number: 14 miles, every day, whatever the ground looked like, whatever shape the column was in. The British had told him the route was a bad one, steep and brutal on the far side of the Chindwin, and they'd suggested an easier line to the south through Sitong and Tammu. Stilwell turned it down. The easy road was the one the Japanese would be watching. On the morning of the 6th at Mansi, he got them moving on foot, everybody except 11 jeep drivers. They made Maghigan. Somewhere on that road, a Chinese mule train came the other way, empty, heading back from India, and Stilwell's people took the mules, 20 animals, and from then on, the mules carried the heavy loads. British forestry officers rounded up 60 hill porters, and then, at sunrise on the 7th of May, in a clearing in the jungle, Joseph Stilwell stood up in front of 114 exhausted people and told them exactly what was about to happen to them. 14 miles a day, minimum. Food was limited, and the arithmetic didn't care how anybody felt about it. Discipline, personal discipline, was the only thing that was going to bring them through. and orders were going to be obeyed. Anybody who thought he couldn't take orders should say so now, right here, in front of everybody, and Stilwell would hand him a week's rations and let him find his own way to India. Nobody moved. Then the general told them the rest of it. By the time this was over, plenty of them would hate his guts, but they were all going to get out. He set the pace himself at the head of the column, weapons slung, in the battered campaign hat he'd worn all through the retreat, and the pace he set was 105 steps a minute. That number isn't dramatic. That's the point of it. 105 steps a minute is the United States Army's regulation marching cadence, straight out of the drill manual, the same beat a recruit learns on a parade ground in Georgia. Stilwell called it an easy pace. He was 59 years old. He was the oldest man in the column by a wide margin, and he walked out in front of nurses, clerks, cooks, and colonels at the cadence of a peacetime drill field into the Changi Valley on the 7th of May. Now, the ground on either side of that stream was thick with vegetation, and hacking a column through it would have taken all day. So Stilwell put his people into the water and marched them straight down the middle of the streambed. 9 crossings and recrossings before the morning was out, boots full of water, packs riding wet, mules slipping on the stones. The heat did the rest. By late morning, it was somewhere around 100 degrees with humidity to match, and the column started coming apart at the joints. Colonel William Holcomb went down first. He dropped out of the line, and they got ammonia crystals under his nose to bring him around. Then Frank Merrill. Merrill was a major, Stilwell's own aide, an athlete, a man in his 30s, and 2 years later he'd be the general commanding the American infantry unit that fought its way back into northern Burma. On the 7th of May, 1942, he staggered to the bank of the Changi and dropped face down into the vegetation. It was his heart. He was unconscious, and there was no way to carry him and no time to stop for him. So they inflated an air mattress, rolled him onto it, and towed the future commander of the Marauders downstream on his back like a piece of baggage. He wasn't the only passenger. One of Seagrave's nurses, a girl named Than Shwebo, had tuberculosis and could barely stand. They put her on a mattress too and hauled her up the trail and through the water. Stilwell kept walking. That's the thing that reads coldest, and it's the thing that saved them. When a man went down in that column, the general didn't stop the march. He trusted the doctors to get to the casualty, load him on a mule if it came to that, and bring him along until he caught up with the column at a rest break or at the bivouac that night. Stilwell's arithmetic was 14 miles a day, and the arithmetic had no room in it for sentiment because the arithmetic was what was going to feed them. Stop for every man who falls, and you spend 3 days making 1 day's distance. Spend 3 days, and the monsoon closes the mountains. The food runs out, and instead of 1 sick major, you have 114 people dying in the hills. So here's the ugly little truth about command that Burma printed on Joseph Stilwell in a single morning. The most humane thing he could do for the weakest people in his party was to refuse, absolutely, to slow down for any of them. That refusal looked like cruelty from the ground. It was the only mathematics that got a tubercular teenage nurse to India alive. He knew exactly how bad they looked. He watched his officers fall out around him and wrote 4 words about it that night, and there's no self-pity in them at all. Christ, he wrote, but we are a poor lot. Now, some of them made things worse on their own. To get cool, men in the column cut the sleeves out of their shirts and the legs off their trousers. And by the afternoon, they'd learned the price of that. Mosquitoes, sandflies, leeches coming out of the wet ground, and the water fastening on wherever there was skin. Picture it, because it's what your whole day is now. You are walking 14 miles through a streambed in 100 degrees of heat, and every few minutes you have to reach down and pull something off your leg. By 1 in the afternoon on the first day, only a few miles into a march of 140, the column behind Stilwell was strung out so badly that he had to give ground. He conceded 10 minutes of rest for every hour of marching. Then his chief medical officer, Colonel Robert Williams, went to work on him. and Stilwell agreed to stop moving through the worst of the midday heat. He also stopped the column and made everybody empty their packs. From that point forward, no member of the party carried more than 10 pounds. Not the officers, not the general. Whatever a man owned above 10 pounds, he left it on the ground in Burma, and the mules took the rest. The routine hardened into something with a shape. 50 minutes of walking, 10 minutes down. Repeat until the midday break. After the break, more of the same, until Stilwell decided the day's distance was in the bank. Their food was porridge, rice, corned beef, and tea. Paul Jones, the transportation officer, wrote it down without complaint. Not much, he said, but it kept them going. On the 8th of May, Japanese bombers came over them. The column scattered into cover and lay still while the engines went across the sky, and then got up and kept walking. And there was nothing else to be done about it. The enemy wasn't only behind them anymore. The enemy was overhead, and Homelin, the town where they had to reach the Chindwin, was a town the Japanese could reach too. Then, on the 9th, Stilwell noticed something in his own column and put it in the diary. They were gradually getting some discipline. Read that against the men on air mattresses, and the leeches, and the officers passing out in the water. 2 days earlier, this was 114 strangers from 4 armies and 3 countries, half of them civilians, running for their lives in a country that was being lost. 2 days of 105 steps a minute, and it was starting to behave like a unit. Late on the afternoon of the 9th of May, the column came out at a village called Mainkaing on the Uyu River, and Joseph Stilwell looked at the water and thought he'd found his people a break. The Uyu was wide and slow and running west, wide enough for rafts, slow enough to sleep on. 2 days off their feet, floating down toward Homelin and the Chindwin, while the current did the work. Word had already gone ahead to the village headman at Mainkaing that the party needed river transport. When Stilwell walked in, a handful of rafts were tied up at the bank, and that was all. By the next morning, the headman had produced enough of them, and on the 10th of May, the party went onto the Uyu River in 5 groups, bamboo and vine. That's what the raft were. An advance guard of 4 American officers took a single platform about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. The other 4 groups each got 3 rafts lashed together into a train roughly 60 feet from end to end, with a thatched hut on top for shade. Nobody had built these things to survive a war. They'd been thrown together overnight by villagers who wanted this crowd of armed foreigners gone. Colonel Robert Williams laid out the routine on the water. 3 shifts around the clock, 1 hour on duty, 2 hours off. On duty, you poled, you paddled, you steered. Off duty, you slept. You ate roughly once a day, and you stayed ready to go over the side at any moment to shove the raft off a snag. Stilwell had meant this stretch as a rest. It wasn't one. The Uyu was sluggish, and a boxy homemade raft on a sluggish river doesn't drift anywhere. It sits. Paul Jones wrote that they had to pole the thing through the long stretches just to get any forward motion at all, in the open, under the Burmese sun. And he added that this was the kind of work that could talk a man out of ever being a soldier again. Then the rafts began to come apart underneath them. Bamboo works loose, vines stretch and part. The party spent the 11th and the 12th watching the platforms they were standing on quietly dissolve into the river, poling day and night to keep the schedule. On the 11th, it started to rain. Stilwell had been racing 2 enemies since Shwebo, and the rain meant the second one had arrived. The monsoon was early. Once it settled in, every trail into India would turn to mud. Every stream would come up in a wall, and the mountain track over the Naga Hills would stop being a route out of Burma at all. He had roughly 100 miles of it still ahead of him. Then, somewhere over the Uyu, a lone British bomber came in low, went past, turned, came back, and dropped wrapped packages of food onto a sandbar. Think about what that meant, standing on a raft in the middle of Burma. Stilwell had smashed his radio 5 days earlier and had no confirmation that any of his messages had ever been heard. As far as 114 people knew, they were walking out of a lost country entirely alone, unlisted, unlooked for. Those packages on the sandbar were the first proof anybody had that India even knew they existed. The mules and the porters had gone overland while the rafts went down the river. under the 14 Chinese soldiers of Stilwell's bodyguard and an American lieutenant named Eugene Laybourne. Mules, porters, rafts, and general all converged near Homolin on the 12th of May, and Homolin was supposed to be the payoff. Homolin was where Stilwell had asked New Delhi to send 500 pounds of food. Homolin was a town with British officials in it, a telegraph office, supplies, and administration. Homolin was empty. The British had cleared out of it in a hurry. Most of the population had gone with them. The telegraph office was shut. There was no food waiting, none at all, no sign that anyone had tried to leave any. And the party that arrived there had been eating rice and corned beef in shrinking quantities for 6 days. Stilwell didn't stand around in the abandoned town. He ordered Laybourne to take the mules to the Chindwin and swim them across. He walked the rest of his people through Homolin and a few miles north to a Buddhist temple, where the priest looked at 114 filthy, armed, exhausted foreigners bedding down among their images and made no attempt to hide what they thought about it. The column slept there anyway. The Chindwin was the last thing between them and India, and the Chindwin is not a stream you march down the middle of. It's a real river, big, brown, running hard, half a mile of it in some places. On the 13th of May, Stilwell walked 2 miles from the temple down to the bank with a handful of his officers and stood there looking at it. Frank Dawn watched him do it. The general bit down on his cigarette holder and frowned, and Dawn wrote that he glared at the water as if by pure force of will he could make some kind of boat appear on it. Half a mile upstream, 5 dugout canoes and a freight boat came around the bend. Stilwell's catching guide shouted across the water, and the boatmen turned in toward the shore. The general had his people formed into 6 lines on the bank, and the boats began ferrying them across the Chindwin piecemeal, load by load, while the current pulled and the mules were driven into the water further down. Now, this is where the whole march turns on a hinge that Joseph Stilwell had no control over whatsoever. He didn't know it standing on that bank. Less than 36 hours after his column left Homolin, a large detachment of Japanese cavalry rode into the town. 36 hours, that's the margin. A day and a half of bad rafts, sick nurses, unfriendly priests, and a general who wouldn't stop for anyone. And on the other end of the arithmetic, a Japanese cavalry force arriving at the exact river crossing he'd just used. Every 10 minutes he'd saved by refusing to stop for the men who fell in the Chongi was 10 minutes of that margin. He didn't save those minutes because he foresaw the cavalry. Nobody foresees the cavalry. He saved them because he'd decided at McGigan that the column would make its 14 miles a day whatever happened, and history handed him the reason afterward, in a currency he never got to count. On the far bank, safe for the first time in 2 weeks, nobody celebrated. Dawn noticed it and wrote it down. What went through the party wasn't relief. It was apathy, physical exhaustion, and a low fear about what was waiting on the other side of the river, because on the other side of the river were the mountains. The trail west of the Chindwin was the worst ground of the entire march. Seagrave was told that only 6 people had gone over that mountain track ahead of them on their way out of Burma. The peaks along it ran to 7,500 feet. The party had no food beyond what it carried. The rain had started, and the porters that the Reverend Case had hired were a shambles to organize. Stilwell stood at the crossing waiting for the mules and the porters to sort themselves out and called the whole business a hell of a mess. Then he took them up into the hills, and he was not impressed with what he saw behind him. Took it easy over a good trail, he wrote that night. The sissies are pooped out. They can't take it. He was 59. He'd been walking since the 7th of May. He'd lost weight he didn't have. His people were coming apart, and the man at the front of the column, at 105 steps a minute, was complaining that everybody else was slow. The Naga Hills go up like a wall out of the Chindwin, and the column went up them on empty stomachs. Nothing had been waiting at Homolin. That meant every calorie the party still had was the food on the mules, and the mules were climbing switchbacks with people hanging onto their loads. The rain kept coming. The trail turned greasy. 7,500 feet of ridgeline was in front of them, and the only reliable information Gordon Seagrave had about the track was that 6 people were known to have used it ahead of them on their way out of Burma. and the Burmese nurses started singing. They sang hymns going uphill, in the rain, on empty stomachs. Onward, Christian soldiers. The battle hymn of the Republic. 19 girls in their teens and 20s, most of them a few days out of a hospital that no longer existed, walking behind a 60-year-old American general in a country that was being lost, singing about the coming of the Lord. Every account of the march that mentions them says the same thing, which is that the singing did more for the column's morale than anything the officers came up with. On the afternoon of the 14th of May, Stilwell led them on a long climb up to a Naga village called Kowloon. There were men waiting for the minute. The British administrator at Imphal, a man named Tim Sharp, had pushed a relief expedition east out of India and had been on the trail for 5 days looking for them. Food, a doctor, ponies. Sharp's people had also been putting up shelters a 1 day's march apart, all the way back toward Imphal. For the refugee columns everybody knew were coming out behind Stilwell, so the party ate. The sick got a doctor who wasn't half dead himself. The lame got ponies. The march that had been running on rice, corned beef, and whatever the jungle offered was suddenly a march with a supply line. And Joseph Stilwell went to his diary that night and wrote one of the strangest lines any commander has ever written about being rescued. Food, doctor, ponies, and everything, quite a relief. Then he added 6 more words, and those 6 words are the whole man, though we could have gone on by ourselves. Now, sit with that. He'd been on the trail for a week. He was 59 years old. He was losing pounds he couldn't spare. He had a major with a bad heart and a nurse with tuberculosis in the column behind him. And a British relief party had just walked 5 days into the mountains to put food into his hands. And the first instinct of the man receiving that food was to record in writing that he hadn't needed it. You can read that as ego, and part of it surely is. There's another way to read it, and I think it's the truer one. Stilwell had lost Burma. He'd lost his armies, his headquarters, his communications, and every instrument of command he possessed, one after another, over 3 weeks. The single thing he had left, the only claim he could still make, was that he'd promised 114 people they were all getting out and he was going to deliver it under his own power, with nothing and nobody helping him. Take that away, and there's nothing left in the man's hands at all. He wanted to walk out owing nothing to anyone. That's not vanity. That's a man holding onto the last piece of himself that the Japanese hadn't taken. Tim Sharp, for his part, had radioed India to ask who he was going out to meet. Paul Jones remembered the answer that came back. Stilwell, India told him, was a brilliant tactician who gathered every piece of information available before making a decision. The information available to Stilwell on the 14th of May was that the monsoon was on and the mountains weren't finished with him. The best day of the march came the next one. Jones and Captain Fred Eldridge went 14 miles ahead to a village called Sayapao to get things ready for the general. And it began to rain on them just short of it. And out of the trees came a party of Naga hillmen carrying umbrellas to hold over the 2 Americans. That's the country the column had walked into. A day earlier, they'd been rationing corned beef and watching the sky for Japanese aircraft, and now hill tribesmen were coming out in the rain to shelter them with umbrellas. Stilwell noticed the Nagas and wrote about them with more warmth than he ever wrote about his own officers. Good-looking, tough, good-humored, friendly. The village chiefs kept stopping the column. At Chamu, a chieftain in a bright red blanket came out and offered the general a bottle of rice beer as a sign of respect. At another village, Stilwell was handed a goat and he gave cigarettes back. And this went on, village after village, up the trail, chiefs turning out with rice beer for the American who was walking his people to India. Stilwell was a teetotaler, and he developed a real liking for that rice beer. Underneath the ceremony, the arithmetic never stopped. 50 minutes marching, 10 minutes down, 14 miles a day. Seagrave crouched in a shelter working on Paul Jones's infected toe with surgical instruments, because in the mountains, an ingrown toenail can take a man out of the column as surely as a bullet. 16, 17 miles a day now, up and down. And the men were trail-hardened enough to take the hills without breaking, and the column was becoming an organization again in the smallest ways. In one of Sharp's shelters, Jones got into an argument with a major about men tracking mud across the floor. A general officer overheard it. So did Stilwell. Jones ended up in trouble with a major general, and a lieutenant general, all over mud on a bamboo floor in the middle of nowhere. And once it was patched up, nobody in that column walked into a shelter in muddy boots again. On the 18th of May, the column came into Ukhrul, a big village high in the hills, and the Assam Rifles of the Indian Army turned out and gave Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell a formal salute. Consider what they were saluting. A man in a filthy campaign hat who'd lost the country, come out of it on foot with cooks and clerks and teenage nurses behind him, and had been officially missing for the better part of 2 weeks. On the 19th, they made 21 miles and hit the truck head at Litan. 2 American officers were waiting there with war news, chocolate bars, American cigarettes and whiskey, and for the first time since the 7th of May, the party did not have to walk to where it was going. Between Litan and Imphal lay 16 miles of mud that had to be pushed and dragged through, then 10 more miles of gravel road. The monsoon was in full fury by then. It had come exactly as Stilwell knew it would, and it had come too late to stop him. Imphal had been bombed, and the craters were still open in the ground when the column came in on the afternoon of the 20th of May. Stilwell walked in with a heavy cold. He'd lost at least 25 pounds off a frame that had nothing to lose, and he was carrying a case of jaundice that nobody had diagnosed yet. Several of his people went straight into a hospital. All of them went in alive, 114. Every American officer, every clerk, every cook, every Chinese soldier, every British straggler, the Quakers who wouldn't carry a weapon, the missionary, the reporter, and all 19 of Gordon Seagrave's Burmese nurses, including the girl with tuberculosis. They'd towed through a river on an air mattress. Thousands of soldiers and civilians tried to get out of Burma that month. Stilwell's party may well have been the only group of any size that came out of the country without losing a single person. 14 miles a day, 140 miles, 20 days, no radio, no rescue, no seat on any plane. He told them at Magigan that a lot of them would end up hating him, and that they were all getting out. He was right about the second part. The men who wrote about him afterward, the ones who'd been dragged up those hills at 105 steps a minute, spent the rest of their lives calling him Uncle Joe. Here's what the walkout says about people, and it isn't comfortable. We tend to think that a leader proves himself by what he protects when he wins. Stilwell had nothing to win with. He'd lost the campaign, the armies, the country, and his own way home. And what was left when all of that was gone was a stubborn old infantryman deciding that the one thing he could still control was whether the weakest person in his column got to India. Strip a man of everything he commands, and you find out what he actually values, because it's the only thing he keeps spending himself on when there's no reward left for spending it. The reward, when it did arrive, arrived late and landed wrong. George Marshall had sent a cable on the 12th of May, while Stilwell was at Homelin, 36 hours ahead of the Japanese cavalry and out of contact with the world. The President, the Secretary of War, and the entire War Department, Marshall said, were filled with admiration for the courage with which he'd faced the hazards of the past 10 days. The message reached him on the 20th because the radio it should have come through had been smashed on his own orders 2 weeks earlier. Stilwell read the admiration of Washington, and then he sat down and wrote in his diary that he couldn't understand why the War Department would send congratulations to a man in the middle of a military disaster. He'd already told Frank Dorn what he actually thought. It had all been a bitter tragedy, he said, and it was worse because it might have been avoided. 4 days later, he was in New Delhi, cleaned up, in front of a room full of correspondents who wanted the story of the general who walked out of Burma. They wanted the march. They wanted the nurses and the mules and the mountains and the old man at the head of the column. Joseph Stilwell gave them none of it. I claim, he told them, that we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it is humiliating as hell. He said the army ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the country. That was the whole statement. the most celebrated feat of personal leadership in the theater, and the man who'd performed it stood up in front of the world's press and refused to call it anything except a defeat. 2.5 years later, American and Chinese troops under Stilwell's command came back down out of those same hills and took northern Burma back.